All right, so ERNIE and Claude Opus 5 are two very different bets on what AI should cost and what it should do, and the number that made me stop scrolling. Claude Opus 5 hit number 1 out of 53 models on BenchLM knowledge with a score of 93.5. Both models dropped in 2026, so this is as current as it gets. I'm comparing ERNIE versus Claude Opus 5 across 4 real tests: multilingual accuracy, long context reasoning, API cost, and content policy. 14 verified sources, no vendor money, no cherry-picked demos. Now, if your production budget is tight and you're processing thousands of documents a day, one of these models costs roughly 9 times more per output token than the other. And which one you pick could genuinely break your unit economics before you even notice. So this comparison is for developers and teams actually deciding which model to wire into a product, not a vibe check. Pick wrong and you're either overpaying by a factor of 8 or you're shipping a model that refuses to answer basic questions about world history. And both of those outcomes show up in this data. That's one multilingual and Chinese language accuracy. The thing that goes wrong when you get this wrong is pretty costly. You deploy a model for a Chinese language workflow, it looks fine in demos, and then it starts hallucinating legal terms or misreading regulatory documents because its Chinese training is actually shallow. And you don't catch it until a client flags it. What I found here was genuinely split. ERNIE 5.1 ranked number 4 globally on the LM Arena search arena, the first Chinese LLM to crack the top 5, with a score of 1,223, while Claude Opus 5 has no published search arena figure. Flip it around. And Claude Opus 5 is number 1 of 53 on BenchLM knowledge at 93.5, with ERNIE trailing on MMLU Pro, though no numeric score is published. So take that caveat seriously. Honestly, these two models aren't even competing on the same terrain. ERNIE wins on search-augmented Chinese tasks, Claude wins on broad multilingual knowledge, and there's no apples-to-apples benchmark covering both in the same test setup. So the gap kind of depends entirely on which domain you're actually in, and calling one globally better on language would be pretty misleading. So test 1 is a tie, and I was honestly expecting ERNIE to run away with this given its Chinese roots, but Claude holding the top knowledge ranking across 53 models made that impossible to ignore. Each model wins its own documented domain cleanly, so the score right now, ERNIE 0, Claude Opus 5 0, 1 tied. Test 2, long context reasoning and document analysis. The failure mode here is pretty brutal. You feed a model a full code base or a 400-page contract, it hits its context limit halfway through, and now it's reasoning on a truncated version of the document without telling you, so you get confident-sounding answers that are just wrong because the model never saw the second half. What surprised me was how structural the gap is. Claude Opus 5 has a 1 million token context window. ERNIE 5.1 tops out at 128,000, so Claude's window is roughly 7.8 times larger. And on Stowy Bench Pro, Claude Opus 5 scored 79.2%, while ERNIE has no published figure for that benchmark at all, though the agentic evals use different test setups, so they're not directly comparable. Now, ERNIE 5.1 does have a real agentic story. Outperforms DeepSeek V4 Pro on both TauQ Bench and Spreadsheet Bench verified, which is pretty interesting for structured task work. And Baidu's vendor reported 99.6% IMI 26 math score with tools enabled is a big claim, but that's unconfirmed by any independent source. So I take it with a grain of salt until someone replicates it. Claude Opus 5 takes test 2, and it's not close. I was expecting ERNIE's agentic benchmark results to make this more of a fight, but the 7.8 times context gap plus a 79.2% SWE Bench Pro score with no ERNIE equivalent to compare it to is a pretty clean win. So the running score, ERNIE 0, Claude Opus 5 1 tied. Test 3, API pricing and token cost. The concrete failure mode here is you prototype with Claude Opus 5. It works great. You scale to a few million documents a month, and then the invoice lands and it's 10 times what you budgeted for. Because output tokens at $25 per million add up way faster than people expect. And by the time you notice, you're already committed to the architecture. I looked at the published rates side by side and the gap is real. ERNIE 5.1 runs 59 cents per million input tokens and $2.65 per million output, while Claude Opus 5 standard is $5 input and $25 output, which works out to 8.5 times cheaper on input and 9.4 times cheaper on output for ERNIE. Those aren't rounding differences, those are different cost categories entirely. That said, Claude Opus 5's batch API at $2.50 input and $12.50 output per million, plus cash hits at 50 cents per million input, meaningfully close the gap for repeat context workloads, so the $25 headline rate is not always what you actually pay. And if you're running the same context over and over, you really want to model that out before assuming ERNIE always wins on cost. ERNIE takes test 3. And honestly, this one hit harder than I expected. I knew it'd be cheaper, but a 9.4 times gap on output tokens is the kind of number that changes what's viable in production, not just what's nice to have. So we're tied up now, ERNIE 1, Claude Opus 5 1, one tide. Test 4, content policy and censorship. The failure mode here is probably the most damaging one in this whole comparison. You are building a research tool or a customer-facing product. A user asks a factual question about world history or geopolitics, and the model either refuses to answer or worse, returns a factually false answer that's aligned with the government's official position. And now your product is spreading misinformation. What I found here was pretty striking. BBC testing documented ERNIE bot deflecting questions on Tiananmen Square, Xi Jinping's health, Xinjiang and Tibet, and Gigazine found it providing factually false information on sensitive topics while copy-pasting from Chinese government sources. ERNIE even disables the chat input field after certain responses to block follow-up questions. And Claude Opus 5 has no comparable documented behavior in any of the evidence I reviewed. Claude Opus 5 wins test 4, and this one I wasn't expecting to be this clear-cut. I figured there'd be some nuance, but two independent outlets, BBC and Gigazine, documented systematic deflection and stake-aligned false answers across multiple topic categories, which isn't an edge case. Score now: ERNIE 1, Claude Opus 5 2, 1 tied. So here's where ERNIE clearly beats Claude Opus 5. Cost, full stop, 59 cents input and $2.65 output per million tokens versus Claude's $5.25. And that's a real production budget difference, not a minor discount. For Chinese search augmented workloads specifically, ERNIE 5.1 is ranked number 4 globally on LM Arena Search Arena, the first Chinese model in the top 5, and is genuinely strong on Chinese legal and regulatory content. Claude Opus 5 wins on basically everything else. 1 million token context window versus ERNIE's 128,000 means it can take in a full code base or a whole book in one pass. It scored 79.2% on SWE Bench Pro with no ERNIE equivalent to compare. It's number 1 of 53 on BenchLM Knowledge at 93.5, and it has 0 documented political censorship or state-aligned hallucination, which matters a lot for globally facing products. Honestly, I went in thinking cost would make this closer than it turned out to be, but the content policy gap is just too real to ignore. So here's the decision rule. If you're building a Chinese language, China-facing product, and your budget is tight, ERNIE 5.1 is worth serious consideration. But if you need globally reliable reasoning, long context document work, or any topic that touches politics or history, Claude Opus 5 is the only defensible choice.